Now, let's wrap up chapter 6 from Schopenhauer to Searle. That is chapter 6 from Eagleton's book, Ideology. Chapter 6 now, we end up talking about George Searle. And this kind of caps this this sort of descent into irrationalism, this irrationalist kind of tradition that Eagleton says, has kind of roots way back in people like Hume, who thought, reason is and ought to be the slave of the passions. And then he says, well, this tradition really gets off the ground in the 19th century. With the likes of people like Schopenhauer and the big blind will that runs everything, Nietzsche, and it's all about power. And then, of course, later on, he talked about Freud with the unconscious, and so that reason in the end is sort of the birth of the subject is, it takes place where reason is, but, it's within this context of either, the blind will or power relations, or with Freud, the unconscious. Okay, so what's going on with Searle? Well, he says Searle is kind of this poeticized Marxism. So there's this aesthetic dimension to Searle, this romantic dimension to it. So this poetical Marxism, what does it mean? Well, let's look at a particular concept that's important to Searle's thought, and it is the notion of a general strike, this big notion of a strike. In the early 20th century, there were a number of these. They had powerful symbolic resonances with populations, and it's a fundamental concept for Searle. Namely, it's a mythic object. So we're now moving where, like Marxism has moved now where it's becoming associated with mythic things. And if you look at old posters of certain movements, there does seem to be this strong romantic mythic dimension to the notion of the worker or whatever, something that's very, and it's mixed up with a lot of artistic movements and so on. All right, which would be an interesting discussion of art and ideology throughout times, but that's unfortunately, haven't got time to do everything. So the general strike is this kind of mythic object, which is a romantic symbol. It's supposed to trigger intuitions that are prior, that are deeper, and also kind of immune to rational analysis. So a rational analysis is something that's sort of going away, and we're looking at more sort of the irrational sides, different kinds of ways of thinking that are not rational in nature. And it's not hard to imagine where this is going to go. So political ideas then, when we think of something like the general strike, it's not just an event that achieves personal ends. It's something more. Political ideas, they're immune to rational analysis. They're not true or false. That's the wrong way to think of them. And we've seen lots of ideologies. It's not right to think of them as true or false. They might be lived or whatever. They're not representations of reality. They're ways of living. Political ideas are vital organizing principles. And this is reminiscent of Nietzsche, right? That they carve up the world to further interests. That political ideas are vital organizing principles in the service of power, desired ends, and that's how they carve up the world. And even just lifted a quotation that Eagleton takes from Searle, like no rational analysis can penetrate the mystery that envelops socialism. And there's more to this quotation, but that gives you an idea of where this guy is going. So the notion of rational analysis is not going to be directly applicable to the notion of political ideas. What are political ideas? Well, again, they're vital organizing principles. They're to generate certain desired states of consciousness, right? It's not true, false, or whatever. They want to make people feel in a certain way. And who gets to do that? Well, probably by the intellectuals that are in charge of the movement, in charge of making things. So you can see how this is now sliding over into the realm of propaganda. Now, Eagleton goes on, discusses this a bit more, but he says like clearly this is leading to the mythification of thought. Now, this opens up another concept. What's a myth, right? But nonetheless, when myths get tied up with thought and politics, you're not too far from sliding historically as we look back into elements of fascism, right? Very deeply connected with notions of mythology and what. But that doesn't mean that all myths are necessarily fascist, by no means. And there are fascist tendencies that aren't definitely not really mythic in nature. So it's a complicated relationship. But when it becomes when myths saturates all thought, it can lead down this pathway. But again, not necessarily so. The question now is, as Eagleton goes on to discuss, is what's the relationship between myth and ideology? And he discusses it in a variety of contexts, namely lots of oppressed people, certain kinds of narratives they tell themselves that may have mythical tinges to them. And are those forms of ideology? How should we unpack this? And so he goes, you can have a look at that discussion. But he says, in the end, we seem to be left kind of with this dilemma that if we take this Enlightenment view of mythology, that myths are something that humanity has before science, before rationality, before we have mechanistic means of explaining things and mathematical and all that stuff, that's the domain of myth. It's kind of this pre-scientific, youthful in the human sense of youthful, like as in a youthful product of the development of humanity. Started off seeing things mythically. You find Ch6 and a variety of thinkers, talked about stages that we would see things in terms of history. And the mythic stage, the religious stage, those were early ones. And then, of course, they were superseded. Why, of course? Well, because you got rid of those mythic elements, because those were anthropomorphizations, etc., etc. And then you come along and you get guys like Newton who have a mechanical view of the world. And that's a more mature view. Well, he says we're left in. So he concludes the chapter. That is, Eagleton concludes the chapter by saying we've got this kind of dilemma. If we take the Enlightenment view that myth and stuff is for kids, for the childhood of humanity, we will outgrow this. But he said this leads to kind of a barren sort of rationalism. He doesn't really explain what that means or why it's so bad, but he thinks it's something distasteful. We're missing something of self-understanding if we understand ourselves solely through this kind of Enlightenment rationalism. But he says, of course, if you accept myth, if you accept it too much, it becomes part of things. You're kind of on that road, maybe to fascism. And fascism, of course, it may not be the end product, but what you could get is some kind of elitism and opportunism by the elites. So myths can have this dangerous element as well. Now, he says, fortunately, this dilemma, and that's the classic thing of a dilemma, is neither option is really palatable. This is ultimately a false dichotomy. We have other options. What are they? Well, we don't really know yet. We'll probably see some discussion of that in the final conclusion of the book. But he just says that we're not trapped in this. All right, so that kind of brings this chapter of the sort of the discussion of irrationalism and its way, as it makes its way through ideology from Schopenhauer to Searle. That comes to an end. And then the next chapter, we're going to look at something quite different and a different way of thinking about ideology. See you in the next video.